the interpretation of the map ideally should be done by the participants with some help from the facilitation team. The participants should be encouraged to focus on the drivers, namely the deep elements or the deep ideas of the structure, and they should identify them, the deep drivers, and also pathways. Pathways meaning walks from the bottom to the top. And those two are the critical things. Why? The deep drivers are those that have the highest leverage. And because they have the highest leverage, they require more focusing, more attention, more resource allocation. The pathways, on the other hand, have a lot of interesting because one can identify pathways of relevance. For example, in the latest experiment that we did with the problematics of the Club of Rome, we discovered two pathways that I personally felt were very interesting. One pathway was what included the manipulation of information, the manipulation of the public, which I personally, because I was the interpreter, called the propaganda pathway. And the way you can look at that propaganda pathway as you walk from the bottom to the top, it can give you some way of how to address that effectively, the propaganda pathway. And then the other pathway for this particular structure that we did, the retrospective problematique for the Club of Rome continuous critical problems, the other one was what I refer to as deliberative democracy. So those two pathways, the propaganda and the deliberative democracy, being the pathways of most significance, are useful for the stakeholders to understand and to agree. And in the case of the problematique, these are the pathways that should be addressed more meaningfully in any attempt to design an action plan for the resolution. The other thing that needs to be addressed, and we did that well in the last retrospective problematique for the Club of Rome, is to draw a distinction between the different types of complexity. In other words, some of those, in the case of the problematique, we had some continuous critical problems that were classified in what we call the objective complexity. We had some that were subjective and some intersubjective. And it's interesting that in the case of the retrospective problematique for the Club of Rome, which has been documented now, and it's available, I think, according to Jeff Diedrich, somewhere in the database of the SDD database. In this case, we discovered, which is non-trivial, we discovered that the intersubjective complexity CCP, the continuous critical problems identified by Osbekam in 1970, that were categorized as intersubjective complexity were at the lowest levels. Namely, if we were to make progress in the resolution of the Club of Rome problematic relevant to the climate predicament, the climate crisis predicament, we could not make progress. We could not resolve the climate crisis without addressing the continuous critical problems that belong to the category of intersubjectivity. And these are primarily ideas originated by Hassan, which are value sensitive and value based. And for example, one of the CCPs that I remember is the perpetuation of the of value bases that are obsolete. That's a CCP that is intersubjective, because if we are going to deal with that CCP, we have to do it collectively and consensually. We cannot really change the value base and change our behavior vis-a-vis the climate change situation unless we have a deliberation and we internalize that actions to be taken so that the climate crisis will be ameliorated required agreements of changing value bases and changing behavior that affect the climate problematic.